There are legitimately 4 teams that feel like they should win the ACC in 2024. And I think they all might have legitimate arguments for who, how, why they're going to win the conference. But I think there are, in reality, there are 2, unless just the craziest things you've never possibly ever considered come to fruition. And I think when you go through the most important games on every ACC team's schedule, you start in week 1 with Miami. And I will bang this drum that Miami should, in theory, on paper, as we sit here in mid-July, you could probably argue should make the college football playoff in 2024. And not because I think they're great, because I think the schedule is not great. And when you look at Miami, I think their biggest game of the season is week 1 at Florida in the Swamp. Make no mistake about it. Whoever loses that game is in a world of trouble. Because I've talked on the podcast before that Florida has the toughest 5-game stretch in college football history to end their season. And if Billy Napier is still the head coach at the end of the 2024 college football season, it's because he worked wonders at Florida. But for Miami, and we'll talk about Florida when we get to the biggest games in the SEC for each team. Whoever loses that week 1 game is in a world of trouble. For Miami, the questions will persist of, if you go to Florida and you lose, when are you going to be back? When are you going to be the Miami that we expect you to be year after year after year? Because you haven't gotten there yet. Miami has a bad schedule. It's not even a not good. Notre Dame, they don't play Notre Dame. And I don't know how to put Notre Dame in. Do I include them in the ACC? I don't know. They don't play Notre Dame. They don't play Clemson. They don't play North Carolina State. They have 3 legitimate tests. They play at Florida in week 1. They play at Louisville, and they play Florida State at home. If you can go 2-1 in those games, you're in the hunt for the playoff and likely in the playoff. As long as you, and I feel like I don't have to, as long as you don't stumble against Wake Forest or Syracuse, yeah, obviously. But they play 3 mildly difficult games. I think Florida is a 5-7 or 4-8 potentially team in 2024, which sucks for them because I think they're getting better. Louisville is going to be a top 25 team, but in the 19 to 25, not the 5 to 8. And Florida State is a preseason top 10 team. So that's it. In a sport where you can afford a loss or even 2, you have 3 difficult games. And depending on how things go, it could be 2 difficult games. It could be 1 difficult game. Their schedule is bad. And Miami can make the college football playoff and really increase their chances of doing so with a week 1 win at Florida. Now, the 3 other schools that think that, hey, we've got a legitimate chance to win the college or to win the ACC, in my opinion, are Clemson, Florida State, and NC State. Those are the teams that think they can win the conference. I think NC State is kind of in their own tier in the ACC, where they're not lumped in with the second-tier teams, but I don't think they're as good as Florida State, Clemson, and Miami. And I don't know, and again, I don't know that I think Miami is all that great. I think their schedule is not great, which is a benefit to them. If you look at NC State, they get a high-profile quarterback transfer in Grayson McCall, the quarterback from Coastal Carolina, who is a winner. He's dynamic, running the football. He can chuck it. He's going to make North Carolina State better. In my opinion, their biggest game is in week 2 against Tennessee. Now, the stars kind of align there for NC State. They have extra time to prepare for this game because they play Thursday in week 1. Also, it's a neutral site game in Charlotte, which is not necessarily a neutral site game. It's basically in the backyard, and you get Tennessee early. I think Tennessee's going to have one of the best defenses in America, so there's going to be a test there. But North Carolina State doesn't have, like we talked about with Miami, doesn't have a tough schedule. They play Tennessee and they play at Clemson. Otherwise, they don't have a lot to deal with. So if you can beat Tennessee, who I think is going to be one of those teams that's hanging around the fringe of the college football playoff, you get a week 2 win against Tennessee at a neutral site, I think there are going to be pretty good things in store for NC State in 2024. Now, for Clemson and Florida State. Florida State, I think most people have as a shoe-in to either make the college football playoff or win the ACC. I don't know how many mock brackets I've seen that didn't include Florida State in the top 12. They play at Notre Dame in November. Indiana at night in November doesn't sound like a great match made in heaven for Florida State. Like a lot of other schools, they can afford one loss. But anything more than that puts them right at that cut line. So they play at Miami, and they're home for Clemson, not directly before they play Notre Dame, but in the season before they play in South Bend on a Saturday night in Indiana for Florida State. They play those two teams. If they are 1-1 in those games, the game against Notre Dame becomes all that more important because I don't think you can afford to lose a second one if you've lost to either Miami and Clemson. So it's a big-time game because on the road at night in Indiana, Notre Dame is the number 5 team, I think, in the preseason poll. You could afford, if you're 1-1, you got to win the game. If you're 2-0, you can afford a loss, and you can explain away a loss of like, yeah, we played a nighttime game in November in a northern state. Didn't go well for us. But it's technically a non-conference game. Doesn't matter. But that's a big-time game for Florida State. And speaking of the Noles, Clemson, when they go to Florida State in Week 6, is a huge game. They open the season at a somewhat the neutral site that North Carolina State plays in Charlotte. Clemson plays Georgia in Atlanta. If you want to call that a neutral site, that's fine. It ain't. That probably doesn't go well for Clemson. And then they also play NC State before they play Florida State. So Clemson very, very easily could come into the game with 2 losses. So your back is already against the wall by the time you get to Week 6. You can afford a loss to Georgia, but you can't lose to either one, I don't think, of NC State, Florida State, if you're Clemson, to have a shot at the playoff. So I chose Clemson's game at Florida State as the more difficult one, but I think you could argue that Clemson versus NC State, and for NC State, their game at Clemson is big time because I doubt that you're getting more than 2 teams from the ACC into the college football playoff. I think you might be hard-pressed to get more than 1 team from the ACC in the college football playoff. But there's going to be this kind of 4-way battle for the conference title, and byproduct of having a now 19-team ACC is that they don't all play each other. So it's going to get sorted out eventually and through the conference championship game. But those are the 4 teams that I think if you were to ask, like, hey, who's going to win the ACC? Those are the 4 answers you might get. I would argue that 85% of them will tell you Florida State is going to win the ACC, and they're probably right. But there are a couple of options out there, and I can see how, if Miami beats Florida State, how you can make a case for other schools. But then there are 2 schools that I think are somewhat kind of in the best of the rest category, where the ACC I think is top heavy, and then the middle has so much parity, where anybody from teams 7 through 18 can probably beat anybody else, maybe 7 through 17. But North Carolina, to me, is in that group of the best of the rest. They play at Duke in Week 5. I think it's a big game. One, obviously, it's a rivalry game. But then also, they're virtually unchallenged before they play Duke. North Carolina starts the season at Minnesota. They play Charlotte, North Carolina Central, and James Madison. So there's a real good chance you go to Duke in week 5, 4-0. You want to go 5-0, and it's a rival. Also, if they beat Duke, you can go 1-1 against NC State and Florida State and probably still be a 10-win team. North Carolina's schedule is as bad or maybe worse than Miami's. And we're talking about Miami being a college football playoff team. Not because they're great, but because the schedule's bad. Also in that best of the rest category, Louisville's right there. I have their Week 10 game at Clemson as their biggest game of the year. Now, Louisville, opposite, like everybody else in the ACC, we're talking about, like, hey, you know what? Their schedule is not good. Louisville's going to have a better chance than anybody in the ACC to prove that they deserve a college football playoff bid. They play at Notre Dame, at Clemson, at Kentucky, and they play Miami. So you're going to have a chance to show whether you belong or not. So I picked the at Clemson in Week 10 because there's a good chance that they're ranked in the top 25 when they go to Clemson, and at that point, who knows what Clemson will be. But you're going to win over them. It's going to be a big deal no matter when you get it, no matter how you get it, no matter where you get it. Louisville, I think, is like an 8-4, 9-3 team. And their 3 losses are going to be to teams that are in the top 25. And at the end of the year, you're like, you know what? They were kind of sneaky good. And then I think that there's everyone else in the ACC, where teams 7 through 17, and then I think Virginia, aren't great. Boston College, first year under Bill O'Brien, I picked their Week 4 game against Michigan State is the most important one on the schedule for them. They're at Florida State, Duquesne, and at Missouri in the first couple of weeks for Bill O'Brien. So you get 2 top 15 teams in the preseason in the first 3 weeks of the year. Not great. Let's argue that they probably beat Duquesne, right? So Week 4, Michigan State is a big deal. Not starting 1-3 is a big deal. It'll be a big focus because I think they can get to a bowl game. I think. But you got to beat Michigan State to do it. For California, who wants to be called California now, we are the California Golden Bears. Not Cal Berkeley, not Berkeley, California. So I'll call them California. They play at Pitt in Week 7. And it's in the middle of a pretty difficult stretch. They are at Florida State, bye week, home for Miami, at Pitt, North Carolina State. They start that stretch before that, actually, with games at Auburn and against San Diego State. So you're looking to essentially avoid a 6-game losing streak with Auburn, San Diego State, at Florida State, Miami, at Pitt, NC State. You're making the cross-country trip. It's difficult. It's an important one to avoid losing 6 in a row. Just like North Carolina's biggest game is Duke, I have Duke's biggest game is North Carolina in Week 5. Duke, real good chance they start the season 4-0. And if they win this one, they're likely 6-0 before they play Florida State after a bye week. So that's a really big game for Duke. I don't know that they are good enough to throw in the best of the rest category, but I also don't think that they are bad enough to lump them down in like the, hey, you know what, bowl eligibility is going to be a tough one. Because I think there's a chance that they start 6-0. At worst, probably 4-2, 5-1. So I think Duke can keep some momentum going, even though Mike Elko's not there anymore. Plus, it's a rivalry game. I don't know what Georgia Tech is, but I picked their Week 9 game at Virginia Tech because they finished the year. They play Miami, North Carolina State, and Georgia. So that doesn't sound like a ton of opportunities for wins the last 3 weeks of the year. So the Week 9 at Virginia Tech, I think Georgia Tech's going to be right on the cusp of bowl eligibility, but I don't know how they get there unless they beat Virginia Tech. So that one's a big one to me. For Pitt, I picked their North Carolina game, Week 6. They play at Chapel Hill. They're coming off a bye week, and at worst, they should be 2-2 after their first 4 games. Their first 4 games are Kent State, Cincinnati, West Virginia, and Youngstown State. They should realistically, I think, be 3-1 after those 4 games. Probably a loss to West Virginia. But if they're not, they're in trouble. And if you're 2-2, you need a win at North Carolina. Otherwise, I think there are questions about Pat Narduzzi. So, easy. North Carolina week 6. SMU is interesting to me because we talked a few weeks ago about, like, what does it look like when you join a Power 5 conference from a Group of 5 conference. And it generally doesn't go well that first year. And I think there are somewhat decent expectations at SMU. They don't get any help to start their ACC tenure. I believe, and I've got to look it up. I think they start their first 2 ACC games are against Florida State, and I think maybe Louisville. Yeah, they're home for Florida State and then at Louisville to start ACC play. So 2 of the 5 best teams in the conference, maybe the best team in the conference, and then the 4th or 5th best team in the conference. It's not great. So I picked their week 4 game against TCU because it's their last non-conference game, rivalry game, and when your next 2 are Florida State and at Louisville before you get a bye, you don't want to go like almost a month without a win. So the game against TCU, to me, is a big one. And now you get to kind of the lower level ACC. Like Syracuse, I think, has a chance to have a really good first year under Fran Brown. One, they don't have a road game until October. They are home to start the season, and their first road game is at UNLV on a Friday night, which is kind of a blessing in disguise because Vegas on a Thursday night is much different than Vegas on a Friday night or Vegas on a Saturday. So they're in and out of Las Vegas, and then their next game is at NC State. So there's a decent chance that they're 5-0 when they go to NC State. Now, NC State will be playing their 7th game. That will be Game 7. It'll be Game 6 for Syracuse. One, it's a bit of an advantage if you look at it from Syracuse's perspective of, like, we have another game film to watch of theirs that we can recognize tendencies, get a better scouting report, etc. And also, NC State will have another game under their belt. That's another game of wear and tear under their belt. So I think that's a big one for Syracuse. That can be kind of one of those sneaky games that, like, if NC State isn't prepared, isn't focused, costs you a chance to play for a championship, I think. Virginia, when you look at their schedule, I feel confident that they can win 2 games, which is not a lot. And I think Tony Elliott is probably the first casualty of the coaching carousel in 2024. And that stinks for him. It stinks for Virginia because they dealt with some difficult stuff under his tutelage. So I picked their week 2 game against Wake Forest because they start the season with Richmond, and then they play Wake Forest. And when you're looking at a season where, like, you feel confident you can win 2 games, starting 2-0 is a hell of a lot better than starting 1-1. And when there's already questions and whispers of, like, are you going to make it through the season? The longer you can punt away that first loss, the better. So week 2 is a big one for Virginia, I think. Virginia Tech is an interesting one to me because I think 2024 should be a big year in their rebuild. They've steadily gotten better. But how big of a big year is 2024 for them? I think it depends on the game at Miami in week 5. Virginia Tech doesn't play NC State, doesn't play Notre Dame. They play at Miami on a Friday night on ESPN, and then they're home for Clemson. That's kind of their schedule. You get 2 big-time games. One of them is on a Friday night at Miami. So I think Virginia Tech can be one of those schools that has an 8-win, 9-win season and feel really good about where they are going forward. But it kind of hinges on that game at Miami. And then for Wake Forest, I picked their game versus California. They're coming off a bye, and then they're home on a Friday night against California, who's making the cross-country trip. So it's a short week, and they've got to fly 3 time zones. So you're coming off a bye. It really is a big benefit to Wake Forest for that schedule. And then I think they're on the bubble for bowl eligibility, and they can't afford a loss to a team that's going to be somewhat similar in that same category as them, like California will be. So they're going to be right on that cut line. They're going to be right at the 6-6, maybe 7-5. But I think it depends on what they do against a team like California. So that's my look at the ACC. Who's the most important game for each team? Want to know your thoughts? Did we miss one? Did we have somebody pegged maybe a little higher in the conference standings than you think? Let us know in the comments below. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.